Welcome to Theorizing with a Hammer. While I said we were going to go into various critiques of the Enlightenment that still assume the viability of reason as understood by early modern thinkers, we need to go over some backstories first. Hence, we will begin a study into the Frankfurt School. Indeed, we may need a genealogy of critical theory in the German vein, one that may disrupt our convergence on the basics of critical thinking and critical theory for a bit of history. Some commonly known amongst Marxists and critical theorists, some obscure. In our last episode, I placed critical theory as part of the broader response to the four horsemen of modernity: Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, and Darwin. This is basic enough, but it also leaves out what is specific to critical theory, capital C and capital T, and its relationship to Marxism. Indeed, understanding the context and historical limitations of the emergence of the ideas is part of what I consider doing critical theory in the first place. For post-structuralists like Foucault and semioticians like Barthes, the author may be dead, but for us, context remains crucial. And it is from the emergence of the interplay of persons and their historical context that we actually get understanding. But first, we need to go through a few just-so stories. Results of the kind of concluding impulses that we find that gives us neat narratives that bracket out what is inconvenient for an explanatory story. Yes, these are reductive in the logical sense of the word. They reduce history to a convenient and transparently motivated tale. Often they function as conspiracies or as activating political myths. But we should not totally discredit them as just false. Most myths contain some relationship to truth. One such story starts with the failure of the industrial proletariat to take charge as the second major downturn of the early 20th century turned into a full-blown depression in the 1930s. In this story, a bunch of Marxists, primarily of Jewish origin, move the class struggle from the base to the superstructure, aiming to erode the faith and hope of Western liberal institutions. This cultural Marxism erodes classical liberalism through postmodernist relativism, pessimism, and self-hatred. Sometimes this is slightly expanded and moved away from the focus clearly it meant to be the Frankfurt School, to continental philosophy after the 1930s, and to European thinkers in the non-analytic tradition in general. This focuses less on the German Jewish intellectuals with a direct relationship to Marxism as it emerged in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century, and thus dodges the accusations of clear anti-Semitism. But it more or less is the same story, and you'll hear it often branded by things like Jordan Peterson's postmodern neo-Marxism and other such category errors. Another such story, though, starts in the late 1960s. At the end of the first and second generations of the Frankfurt School, as profitability rates declined in the US and Europe, and the new social compact that had emerged in the post-war period started to end, the UF turns to the Frankfurt School, which focuses on the superstructure and uses it to look at a new revolutionary subject. Hence, critical theory becomes a front face of neoliberalism, at first by accident, and then later on intentionally. This looks just like the above narrative in many ways, but instead of undermining liberalism, it sets it as undermining Marxism with eclectic liberalism. Now, we'll come back to these two narratives throughout this series, a series that we're going to call Once Upon a Time in Central Europe. But we should note that both of the narratives I spoke of are really products of the last 30 years, even if they incorporate elements of actual history or accusations going back to the 1930s. While critical theory in the broad sense has come to inform a variety of subdisciplines of literary criticism, media studies, sociology, political science, and has seemingly developed into many different schools from critical legal theory, critical race theory, post-structural critical theory, anti-humanist critical theory, etc. These are often just tangentially related to critical theory, capital C, capital T, as such. And remember, going back to our prior episode, here conceptual nominalism applies. Just because something shares words, particularly in English, does not indicate a strong relationship historically or logically between the concepts. Critical race theory has only a tangential relationship to historical critical theory. It does have one, though. The same is true with post-structuralist theory, which often was in hot contestation with capital C, capital T critical theory. Generally speaking, critical theory, when it is capitalized, and as we generally refer to it on the Zero Books channel, developed primarily from the end of the first generation of thinkers linked to the Institute for Social Research, founded in 1923 in Frankfurt, Germany, or in short, the Frankfurt School. Yet to truly grasp what this is, we need to look at the early first generation of the Frankfurt School, which is a different set of thinkers, and the early development of the school, as well as the origins of the second generation and the coining of critical theory in 1937. Financed by the father of a wealthy socialist, Hermann Weyl, and his more politically active son, Felix, the Frankfurt School was one of Felix's many attempts to bring together what he thought were the various schools of Marxism to do what is commonly called now unlearning Marx or purifying Marx. Note that it was clear as early as the middle to late 1920s that Marxism, for both political and economic reasons, was dividing into various schools. The split between the Second and Third International, after World War I, divisions over crisis theory, divisions over imperialist theory, divisions over ideas around monopoly capital, divisions over the Marxist relationships to law, the state, and even aesthetics, divisions over how the state were to be organized, were beginning to be made clear that there was no longer, if there ever was, and no, I personally do not think there has ever been a clear thing called Marxism that has a singular orthodox school, that there was no longer a uniformed orthodox interpretation of Marxism. These disparate Marxist thinkers, often in trouble with the official party Marxism in both communist parties and the social democratic ones, would all play a role in the Frankfurt School development of critical theory, and two of them would be among its more obscure but important members. Wittfogel, a member of the KPD, the Communist Party of Deutschland, was often in trouble with the Comintern in Moscow, became a member, focusing on Asiatic modes of development, and Pollock would become strongly associated with the Frankfurt School, and in many ways would become its primary economic thinker. But the first director of the Institute, Karl Grünberg, and many of the associate thinkers, like Heinrich Grossmann, Fritz Dornberg, and by 1928, Friedrich Pollock, were interested in the subjects linked to classical Marxism in both its social democratic and communist forms. Basic political economy, studies of imperialism, the history of the socialist labor movement in Europe. Most of the Institute through the 1920s and early 1930s were not party members of any of the communist parties. Many were disgusted with the direction of the SPD, the Socialist Party of Germany. But also, Pollock in particular, after visiting Moscow in the mid-20s, were skeptical of the Comintern line and of the USSR. The research-focused topics were also extremely contemporary to the time. Furthermore, Grünberg was a teacher to many of the founders of Austro-Marxism, and had taught at the University of Vienna before moving to Frankfurt to head the Institute. He was actually the second choice. Among his students, though, were many of the leaders of German and Austrian social democracy and Austro-Marxism, including Otto Bauer, Rudolf Hilferding, and Karl Renner, prior to his tenure at the Frankfurt Institute. These key figures of Marxism in both Germany and Austria in the 1920s, and a few of them played key roles in the Austrian resistance to fascism in the early 1930s. A spirit of ecumenicism was inherent to Austro-Marxism, which had initially tried to bridge the Second and Third International through the botched Vienna International. While largely linked to the Austro-Marxist thought in which the Frankfurt School was loosely associated, the Institute first published The Economist, Heinrich Grossmann, in 1929, with his very important study, The Laws of Accumulation and the Breakdown of the Capitalist System. Grossmann had been Grünberg's student after having been in several socialist and social democratic parties in Galicia, Poland, and Austria. This work was a key work in the early Marxist crisis theory, expanding the notions of countervailing tendencies developed through critiquing his former and late comrade, Rosa Luxemburg's own articulations of crisis theory. Almost immediately though, Friedrich Pollock published State Capitalism: Its Possibilities and Limitations in 1929. This work focused on the question of state capitalism in light of the increasingly centralized economies in Western Europe and his prior studies in the Soviet Union. The two first published works of the school were thus formally works of Marxist political economy. They were also on the themes of debates within Marxism in the 1920s, which had beginnings in the Second International. The tensions between the monopoly capitalist and crisis theories of Marxist political economy. Crisis theory had been articulated primarily by Rosa Luxemburg, developed in the evolutionist theories of Bernstein and in the finance capital works of Hilferding. Note that while they both assumed a monopoly capital, they did not share the same frameworks. And both, we might call them schools of thought, although they didn't think of themselves that way, found strong evidence in Marx and Engels. And in many ways, Lenin's theory of imperialism had tried to combine the early crisis theory with the monopoly capitalist ones, pulling from Hilferding and Luxemburg alike, to explain the actions of capitalist states and their weights of accumulation. But Grunberg's own work largely remained in the historical development of the labor movement, where he kept extensive archives. His career with the Frankfurt School was brief, however. He suffered a stroke in 1929, which led to his early retirement. Grunberg had encouraged an interdisciplinary approach, but the institute was to have a narrow focus, bringing in the historical, sociological, and legal work to specifically studying the working class. With Grunberg's stroke, Max Horkheimer became the director of the institute in 1930, after Grunberg's retirement. There was a shift to an even broader interdisciplinary concerns. While there was a shift in the research program, Horkheimer remained concerned with the materialism and with Marxism formally. That he strove to incorporate more diverse schools of thinking into the interdisciplinary seminars offered by the school, and breaking down subject divisions within political economy. Following Marx, Horkheimer asserted that social philosophy needed to not just understand the world, but also to alleviate both individual and collective suffering. This focus on the individual and the relationship to a social totality, as well as studying the nature of social totality, reflected concerns of early Marx, whose manuscripts were largely becoming available in what would be later known in English as the Mega, or the Marx-Engels Archive. Horkheimer also reasserted a focus on Hegel, though he immediately criticized Hegel for transfiguring oppression. Horkheimer also rejected the metaphysical idealism of Hegel, again returning to Marx. However, Horkheimer reacted to the idea in both Marxist and bourgeois social research, eschewing philosophy altogether. Horkheimer then critiqued the sciences for becoming too specialized, and thus for limiting any examination of the social roots and social meaning of natural inquiry, and thus positing itself as somehow outside of society. Thus, in this inaugural address of the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer had given us a few new elements: the emphasis on suffering and happiness, both socially and individually, thus introducing psychological studies to his materials program. The role rationality played in emancipatory movements and its limits, a distrust of both metaphysics and of positivistic science, and the necessity of interdisciplinary research. While rejecting relativistic claims of fact, Horkheimer seems to have adopted a fatalism based on a psychological understanding of the preconditions of social totality and the economic base, limiting our ability to see knowledge. He seemed to have pulled a lot from the theories of Lukács on this. Thus, truths were limited to human activity corresponding to a given social period. And to use Horkheimer's own words, albeit translated into English. And again, we notice a similarity to the younger Marxist concern with the human species being and its existence as a nature, but boundedness to historical times and modes of production which limited its immediate expression. Thus, facts are, as in things, but they cannot be said to be known objectively without a history and without our social context. This, interestingly, was not a shift in the focus from Grunberg, who had also thought that transhistorical rules were suspect and that Marxist institutes and research programs should be very wary of them. But Horkheimer expanded this focus, despite being cast as a shift away from the political economy. This is not seen to be totally true in either Horkheimer's directive nor in what the early Frankfurt School published. As Horkheimer stated in his initial address, the economy is the first cause of wretchedness, and critique, theoretical and practical, must address itself primarily to it. Horkheimer's later critiques of communism, which we'll talk about later, were actually mirroring Lenin's. The Institute's publications were, at first, even under Horkheimer's auspice, primarily economic. Henrik Grossman did another work on value price transformation and crisis theory. Kirk-Baumann did a work on autarky and planned economies. Pollack commented on crisis theory in response to Grossman. Ruschka, I hope I pronounced that name right, did work on the labor market and the penal system. Increasingly, however, particularly once the Frankfurt School largely left Germany, focusing on studying National Socialism on one hand and the New Deal and Keynes on the other, while Wittfogel focusing on late imperial China's so-called economic structure, one cannot see a lack of political economy in their work. However, we will stop our history here with one note. During the early studies, and we are not yet capitalizing critical theory when we talk about this, even when referring to the Frankfurt School here, there could not have been said to be a new project. This redirection would not come until Max Horkheimer's summation of the project with his essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, written in German, but in the US in 1937. And you might go, why the US? Well, that's obvious given our historical context. With the school's association with Austrian Marxism and the fact that a vast majority of its members were Jewish by Nazi definitions, if not their own personal, in 1933, the school relocated to Geneva, where it had priorly established a satellite research institute, and then quickly to the US at Columbia University, with additional financing, again from Felix Weil. This had some immediate effects on the writing, though. Explicit references to Marxism and Marx were obscured. You can see this even in the title of Grossman's first work, which was abbreviated to Accumulation in the Capitalist System, dropping the breakdown, and remained untranslated into English until the Indian Trotskyist and economic historian Jairus Banerjee translated it into English in 1979. Furthermore, most references to Marxism were coded as materialism or as critical theory, depending on the time period, both terms which Horkheimer have used before, but not as code. However, despite decoding, there is yet another significant shift in focus. But we will end here and go into the 1937 shifts as part in the next part of our series.